Briar Rose. There once was a kingdom ruled by a king and queen who had no children. The king and queen were saddened because they wanted children very much. One day, as the queen was taking a bath, she spoke of her wish again. "Oh, how I wish I had a child," she said to herself with a sigh. Suddenly, a frog jumped out of the bath water and said, "You shall have your wish, O queen. Within a year you will have a baby girl." And he hopped away. Sure enough, before a year had passed, the queen gave birth to a beautiful little girl. The king and the queen and everyone in the kingdom were overjoyed. The king had a great feast prepared to celebrate the occasion. He invited all the members of his family, all his friends, and all the wise men and women in the kingdom. Among the wise people in the kingdom were 13 fairies who lived together. These fairies could eat only from gold plates. The king, however, had only 12 gold plates, so he invited only 12 fairies. The 13th fairy had to stay at home. This made her very angry. The feast was magnificent, and when it was over, the 12 wise fairies gathered around the baby's cradle to present her with their gifts. One gave her wisdom, another beauty, the third virtue, the fourth gentleness, and many other similar gifts. The 11th fairy had just given her gift when there was a clap of thunder and a puff of black smoke. Suddenly, the 13th fairy appeared. She had been sitting at home feeling very hurt and very angry because she had not been invited. She got angrier and angrier until she flew into a rage and wished herself at the palace. Without looking to the right or left, she walked up to the baby's cradle and stretched out her magic wand. "On her 15th birthday," she said in a loud voice, "the princess shall stick her finger with a needle and die." And without another word, she vanished in another puff of black smoke. Everyone at the feast was terrified, especially the king and queen. The 12th fairy, however, had not yet given her gift. She stepped forward and said, "I cannot take away that evil gift, but I can give the princess something that will save her. She will not die, but fall into a deep sleep that will last for 100 years." The king immediately commanded all needles in the kingdom destroyed. No one could make clothing or mend stockings or do any kind of sewing until after the princess had passed her 15th birthday. This meant that for a long time, everyone in that kingdom had to have their clothes made elsewhere. In the meantime, the princess enjoyed the other gifts the wise fairies had given her. She grew up to be gentle and wise and virtuous, and so beautiful that everyone who saw her fell in love with her. On her 15th birthday, the king and queen went hunting, leaving the princess in the palace. Not a needle, not even a pin, had been seen in the kingdom for 15 years, and they felt sure that the danger had passed. Left alone to amuse herself, the princess roamed about the palace as she pleased, going into all the many rooms and banquet halls until she came to an old tower that she had never noticed before. Up a narrow, winding staircase she climbed until she came to an old wooden door. Pushing it open, she walked into a little room at the very top of the tower, high above the palace. Sitting in the room was an old woman sewing with a needle and thread. "Good day, old woman," said the princess. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" "I'm sewing," replied the old woman. "What is that in your hand?" asked the princess, who had never seen anyone sewing before. "It's a needle," answered the old woman. "See how it pulls the thread through the cloth." "Sewing looks like fun," said the princess. "It is," said the old woman. "Would you like to try?" The princess sat down next to the old woman, took the piece of cloth and the needle, and tried to sew. The first time she pushed the needle through the cloth, she stuck it into her finger. "Ouch," said the princess. "I feel sleepy." And she began to yawn and rub her eyes. "Sewing tires you," said the old woman. "Why don't you lie down and sleep a while?" There was a bed nearby, upon which the princess lay down. She fell into a deep sleep at once. So did the entire palace. The king and queen, who had just returned from the hunt, fell asleep on their thrones. All around them, their lords and ladies were sleeping too. The palace dogs went to sleep while wagging their tails. The horses in the stable all went to sleep. The pigeons, nesting under the eaves of the roof, tucked their heads under their wings and went to sleep. Even the flies on the wall went to sleep. In the kitchen, the flames in the fireplace stopped flickering and crackling and remained still as though frozen. The water boiling in a pot stopped boiling. The cook was just about to pull the kitchen boy's hair. They both went to sleep, with the cook's hand clutching the boy's golden locks. Even the wind around the palace stopped blowing. The leaves on the trees stopped fluttering. The plants stopped growing, and the flowers stopped blossoming. Everyone and everything in and around the palace slept, except for the old woman, for she was really the 13th fairy in disguise. She came down from the tower and walked through the palace, chuckling and laughing to herself. Outside in the courtyard, she stamped her foot upon the ground. A thick hedge of briars began to grow up around the palace. It was a hedge of beautiful roses with long, sharp thorns. Higher and higher grew the hedge until it hid the palace from sight. And still the princess and the palace slept. The story of the sleeping princess spread throughout the land. She became known as Briar Rose because of the beautiful roses on the briar hedge surrounding her. So famous did she become that her story was told in kingdoms far from her father's realm. Young princes, drawn by these tales of the princess's beauty, came from other lands and did their best to cut through the hedge. But the hedge was too tough and dulled their swords. The thorns caught on their clothing and held them prisoner until they died. Gradually, as years went by, people began to forget what lay behind that hedge, until only a few remembered. They told the story to their children, and their children told the story to their children, and so on down through the years. Almost 100 years passed that way. Then one day, a prince from a land far across the sea came to the enchanted kingdom. He met an old man who told him the story of the sleeping princess and of the wonderful hedge that kept the world from her. The prince was so taken with this story and with the old man's description of Briar Rose's beauty that he cried, "I have to see her for myself." The old man tried to persuade him not to make the attempt. "The hedge is high and thick," he warned, "and the thorns will catch you and hold you. Besides, it may only be a story. No one knows for sure if such a princess is really there, or if she ever lived." "No matter," said the prince. "I must see for myself. I want to see this beautiful sleeping Briar Rose before I return home." The prince traveled many days until he came to the hedge surrounding the palace. He arrived on the very day that the 100 years of the fairy's spell was to end, the very day on which the princess was supposed to wake up. As the prince came near the hedge, the thorns turned into flowers, and the branches of the hedge turned aside to let him pass. In the palace courtyard, he saw soldiers lying on the ground asleep. In the stables, he found horses sleeping in their stalls. Up under the eaves of the roof, he saw pigeons, with their heads nestled under their wings, fast asleep. Inside, he walked past sleeping servants and saw the king and queen asleep on their thrones, surrounded by their sleeping attendants. He continued on through the palace until he came to the winding staircase that led up to the old tower. Up the stairs he went and opened the old wooden door. Then he entered the tower room. On the floor lay a piece of cloth, and beside it a needle and thread. And there on the bed lay Briar Rose, the sleeping princess. Never had the prince seen anyone so beautiful. He fell in love with her at once. Bending over, he kissed her. As he did so, the princess's eyelids began to flutter. She opened her eyes and looked up at him and smiled. He helped her from the bed, and they went downstairs together, hand in hand. As soon as they walked into the throne room, the king and queen woke up. They rubbed their eyes and stretched their arms as though they had been asleep for a long time. All about them the lords and ladies of the court woke up too. The horses in the stable woke up and neighed for food, for they were very hungry after their long sleep. The palace dogs woke up and wagged their tails. The flies on the walls began to crawl and fly about. In the kitchen, the fire crackled and burned again, and the water went back to boiling. The cook woke up and finished pulling the kitchen boy's hair. He cried, "Ouch!" and wished that he was still asleep. Everyone in the palace was as young as they had been 100 years before, for the enchanted sleep had kept them from growing old. Soon after, there was a wedding at the palace. Briar Rose and her prince were married, and he took her away to his own kingdom where they lived happily for many years. The king no longer forbade needles, and everyone went back to sewing clothes and darning socks again. Because of their long, long rest, the king and queen and all their court were known as the brightest, most wide-awake people in the whole world.